A warm welcome to the CBS This Morning podcast. I'm CBS News national correspondent Errol Barnett. Author Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, examines America's hidden caste system and its ramification on American society. The New York Times bestseller and Oprah Book Club pick is set to be turned into a film for Netflix, directed, written, and produced by Ava DuVernay. The Pulitzer Prize journalist joins me now to talk about her book, its message, and what comes next for the movie and her views on the world. So, Isabel, welcome.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me.
This is such a compelling read. It's both what I find fascinating, artfully written in that you tell interesting stories. It's a compelling narrative, but it's backed by so many details and so much research, and you traveled the world to come to this realization that America has effectively a caste system. For the uninitiated, why did you jump into this topic, and how did you end up at this realization?
Well, I came to the topic through the first book that I wrote, The Warmth of Other Suns, in which I was writing about the outpouring of 6 million African Americans from the South to the rest of the country during much of the 20th century. And in trying to describe why they did what they did and had this massive impact on the rest of the country, culture, and so many other aspects of American life, I had to describe what they were leaving. And in doing so, I was having to kind of recreate that world. And that world was one of tremendous repression and authoritarianism, and in fact, brutality. And it was very hierarchical. And in fact, it was a world in which it was against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. You could go to jail if you were caught playing merely checkers with a person of a different race. It was a world in which there was actually a Black Bible and altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court. The very word of God was segregated. So it was far more than just the water fountains and the restrooms. It was far more than just people who were being, separated per se. It was something far deeper. It was about maintaining boundaries and hierarchy at all cost. And so I began to do further research, and I discovered that anthropologists who had gone into the Jim Crow South during the depths of it emerged from their work with using the word caste. Caste being an artificial, arbitrary, graded ranking of human value in a society in which everything that you can and cannot do is based upon where you rank in that hierarchy. That's the word that they use, and that's the word that I came to use in The Warmth of Other Suns. A lot of people think that, the word racism is in the book, but actually the word racism is not in the book, because I was looking for a word that was more comprehensive to get at the structure that was in place to hold people in a fixed ranking in that world.
And this is why you use the house analogy when describing what a caste system is, because a common refrain we hear from people in the current moment is, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I didn't enslave people. So why should I suffer from that judgment or have to even address it? Talk about that house analogy.
Yeah, well, I came to the idea of structure. I mean, it's focusing on structure because that's essentially what caste is. Caste is about the infrastructure of division that's built into a society. And that made me think about houses and buildings that we work and live in. And so the idea is that, if we imagine ourselves to be inheritors of an old house, you inherit this old house. You did not build the uneven pillars and joists in that building. You had nothing to do with how the foundation was built well or weakly. However it was built, you are now the current owner of it. So you had nothing to do with the flaws that you have now inherited. But it is your responsibility to deal with those flaws and to correct those flaws, because you as the current owner, we as the current owners of the house, the old house we call America, are responsible for what we do with it now. And so it's a way of understanding our role and our responsibility. And also the fact that, a country is like an old house in that it could be many centuries, in some cases millennia old, and that the current occupants are the ones who are responsible for dealing with it at the moment.
And in this old house of ours, why is the concept of race so unique when compared to other countries and world history? How is the American view of race, forget about racism, how is
Yeah.
that special here?
Well, I think one thing that we often don't think about because it's been with us for so long as any of us, alive, of course, today can think about it, and even our parents and grandparents, and going back beyond that, the idea of race and the ranking of people, the idea of there being Black people and white people, and the various gradations in between. We accept that as the received wisdom of the ages, but actually, this is only 400 or 500 years old. The idea of identifying people and categorizing them on the basis of their skin color is relatively new. And it makes sense if you think about world history, in that for most of human history, people were confined to the parts of the world where people look like them live. So you had people who were European, who were Irish or Welsh or German or Hungarian, whatever they might have been. And they identified themselves on the basis of that. They didn't identify themselves on the basis of skin color because everybody looked pretty much the same. And the same goes for other parts of the world where if people were in sub-Saharan Africa, they were not identifying themselves on the basis of skin color. They were identifying themselves on the basis of the ethnicity, what part of the land they were from, the lineage in that respect. And so it's only when people from different parts of the world arrive to this land, either by choice or by force, as in the case of people from Africa who were brought here to be enslaved, then it was only when you have a combination of people who look different from themselves those superficial differences were then used to build essentially a hierarchy in which the people who were building that hierarchy, the English colonists, established themselves at the top, and then they decimated the numbers of indigenous people and drove them from the land, as we so tragically are aware of, and then of course bringing in Africans to do the hard work of building the country, building the infrastructure of what we now know to be the United States, without pay. They were assigned to and relegated to the very bottom of this bipolar hierarchy that has many characteristics of a caste system. And so that's how we can see the connection between how race was used as a tool, as a signifier for who would be viewed, who would be positioned where in this hierarchy.
And as you write and point to, it wasn't some simple exercise in categorization of people. It was created for the sole purpose of creating a white, more dominant, upper class, quote unquote, race, and a lower class. So you, at no point in American history, have had race without racism. It was created to be used as a tool of power.
Absolutely, and it was something that emerged and evolved over time as the colonists, as people from other parts of Europe joined this bipolar structure and arrived. They may have arrived as Irish, they may have arrived as Dutch, but they were folded into this new category that had no reason for existing before, meaning the category of white. And any of the people who were arriving from sub-Saharan Africa, who would have been many different peoples coming from all parts of primarily West Africa, but not the same people, but all lumped together because of what they look like. And that's how you create this hierarchy, a bipolar hierarchy. And of course, anyone coming in from outside of those two places over the course of time also had to navigate how they were going to fit in this bipolar system. And the natural human reaction is to find ways to survive, which meant having to identify with, accede to, reach out to, or fulfill the expectations of the dominant group, meaning to the closer one could position oneself to the dominant group, the better off one would fare in the society.
You also write, and this is, what jumps out to me about the book is that it's, as I mentioned, so beautifully written as we explore these concepts, which can be quite painful for many people. But one of the lines that jumps out to me is where you noted that racism is not you talked about how it changes over time. You said racism is not the classical racism of our forefathers' era, but a mutation of the software that adjusts to the updated needs of the operating system. How
Yeah.
did that concept of power, white over black and others, evolve to what we see today?
Well, one of the ways it evolved was how who could be a citizen in this country. I mean, over time, to build up the ranks of what was viewed as a dominant caste, the immigration laws would change to adjust to whatever was the need of the dominant group. So for a time, people who were from Eastern and Southern Europe were not permitted to actually even enter the country in large numbers. In 1924, there was an immigration act that restricted people from Western and from Eastern and Southern Europe. And then over time, that changed and mutated to allow them to be included as part of the dominant group, meaning identified as white. And then opening up after the civil rights movement to people from other parts of the world, which also further added to the range of who could be viewed as American, but then people who are here trying to fit into into this, what was primarily a bipolar caste system, then found themselves also trying to adjust to figure out how best to survive in this, what was a bipolar caste system. And so what we find is that over time, the definition of who could be a citizen, who could be identified as white, who would be permitted into the country and on what terms, have all adjusted over time. But the underlying hierarchy has remained, and we can see how it plays out, along the border as people are attempting to enter the country, and then are being held there even as we speak, because they are now seen as not fitting into the definition of who should be an American. So this is an ever-changing, mutating system. One thing I want to say, though, is that what has always been at the core of it was to have a bottom rung, to have people who were essentially the descendants of those who had historically been put at the bottom, people who have been enslaved, and anyone coming in who looks like them also can get folded in to this category that, again, did not exist before. I mean, one of the quotes in the book is from a Nigerian playwright who said, "There are no Black people in Africa." There are no Black people in Africa because that is not how people, are needing to see themselves when they're surrounded by others who look like them. An entire subcontinent of people who look like that. So these are ways that it adjusts over time. But the bottom rail, the bottom rung, seeming to always be there at a fixed place. One thing I want to say too about caste is the many ways that caste exists in our language. Caste without an E, meaning, the mechanism that's used to hold fractured bones in place. The idea that caste in our language speaks to that which is to be held in a fixed place, the boundaries that hold everyone in place. And you also think about a stage, the cast of a play in which there's a person stage right, stage left, someone in the foreground and the background, and people know their lines, people know who's supposed to be where. And one of the ways that we see that playing out today is the idea that while we may not be experiencing overtly and in the ways of the past where we had classical open racism, our forefathers era, but we do see people autonomically responding to assumptions about who belongs where. The idea that people could be at a coffee shop in Philadelphia and someone calls the police on them as they're waiting for a friend. The idea that a family could be in Oakland, at a barbecue and someone calls the police on them. And the idea that, a businessman could be, opening the door to the lobby of his own condo building in St. Louis, and somebody from what I would call the dominant caste instantly recognizes or believes him not to belong there. He's out of his place, and takes it upon herself to block him from getting into his own condo building, and then not out of fear, but out of a sense that he doesn't belong there, needing to prove to herself that he actually belongs there, and follows him on the elevator up to his floor to confirm to herself, like to check him, to police him. And so this is what I mean by the shadow, the continuing vestiges of the hierarchies and assumptions and the boundaries, the policing of the boundaries that seem to be so autonomic and that we see time and time again. Not to mention, of course, the most brutal manifestation, meaning the videos that we've seen, so many of them, of unarmed people who were descendants of people who had been assigned to the lowest caste to begin with, dying before our very eyes at the hands of police or of others, for the same unconscious biases and assumptions about them and where they belong or don't belong.
what strikes me is that you get this sense that it's not accidental. And so, whereas even in the media, we will treat those stories as breaking news, as shocking incidents, as things that go viral, people will comment and say, I cannot believe it. But by this point, it's so frequent and it happens so much, and it's attached, as you spell out um, so eloquently, to this history of categorization. I'm just wondering if you think, is the problem that we keep acting surprised, or are we surprised because we're not educated about how purposeful this structure is?
That's such a great question, because I think the answer is yes to both. I
Mm.
think that we act surprised because we don't know how deeply embedded this is in our history, that it goes back so far. It goes back to from before there was the United States of America, that this is in some ways sadly, the foundation, the hierarchy, and the ways that people are treated on the basis of their perceived standing and ranking of human value, that these are part of how the country was founded, and it's been embedded in the laws. The idea too that that this was so much a part of the country that most of throughout most of American history, the laws were the framework for this hierarchy, and this was not overturned until the 1960s. It's very much the civil rights legislation in 1964, 65, and 68 that then opened up a way for people who've been relegated to the bottom rung, the lowest caste, the subordinated caste, were then permitted to move into the mainstream of American life. I mean, this is very, very new when you think about the long, decades and centuries of American history. I mean, one of the things I want to say is that the idea of enslavement, which was the primary foundational mechanism of creating a caste system, went on for so long that it won't be until the year 2022 that the United States will have been an independent nation for as long as enslavement lasted, because enslavement lasted for longer than the United States is old. That's how long it went on. And no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans or the descendants, the Black people, will have been free in this country for as long as they were enslaved. That won't happen until 2111. That's when African Americans or Black people will have been free for as long as they were enslaved. That is massive to give us a sense of how long this lasted. And it's when you realize how long this lasted and how, in some ways, how deeply embedded it has been in both the country's culture and its jurisprudence, that you begin to see that these should not be surprises in some ways. If they have not been dealt with, then it should not be a surprise.
And my experience in the US is unique and interesting in that I was originally, I'm from England. My mother's a white English lady. My dad is a Jamaican man. And by the time I moved to the US at age 10, these labels of African American and Black were foreign to me. And since then, people have always kind of saw me one way, hear me speak, and they kind of, you see their head tilt. And it breaks their perception of what someone looked like me should sound like. And in fact, even when part of my assignments included traveling the African continent, I was there for 2 years. I went to half the countries in Africa. The Africans would call me a Mzungu, which is their term, usually reserved for a white person, but an outsider. And if my head didn't spin when what was in my mind, hey, I'm going back to my own motherland. My ancestors are from Africa. Here I am. Here I'm back, everybody. And they could quickly identify me as an outsider, as from far outside the continent. You start to realize how unique the American categorization of peoples really is. You traveled to other countries to study some of the similarities and differences. I know there's a lot that you've talked about as far as similarities in India, but could you touch on how even Nazi Germany studied and saw value in the structures that the US had created in codifying in law how you separate people?
Yeah, well, I ended up, primarily, as focusing on the United States. That's what the book is about, but looking toward other places to help us better understand how we got to where we are, again, the origins of our discontents. And then that actually took a turn when, after Charlottesville happened, and you could see in the regalia the merging of these symbols of the Confederacy and of Nazi Germany. They made this connection, and it made everyone sit up and take notice. And it was at that point that I then started to look at Germany as to what they had been doing in the ensuing decades after World War II. How had they been dealing with their history, wrestling with their history, and atoning for their history? And so I had no idea when I went in that there would be so many layers of connection between the Third Reich, the founding of the Third Reich, the early years of it, and things having to do in the United States. It turned out that there were German eugenicists who were in dialogue with and consulting with American eugenicists. I mean, I would never have imagined that there actually were American eugenicists who were writing books that were huge sellers in Germany, and that the Nazis actually incorporated the books written by American eugenicists into their curriculum for their students in the early years of Nazi Germany. And of course, the Germans needed no one to teach them how to hate. They did not have to come here to learn how to hate. But what they did do is that they sent people to research the American laws. How had Americans managed to create a jurisprudence, a legal framework for subjugating African Americans? How had they subjugated African Americans on the whole? And so they looked at the laws against marriage across racial lines, what we would call the anti-miscegenation laws. They looked at the definitions, the range of definitions that Americans had created in defining who was considered white, who was considered Black, who was considered Chinese, how they divided up the population into categories. They looked at the American categorization of humanity, and they looked at those things as they would go back and they actually debated the American laws as they were constructing what would ultimately become the Nuremberg laws. It was just wrenching to see that, to discover that.
And some of it they found too excessive.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
There were a range of definitions that different American states applied to who would be identified as Black. This main definition, again, having to do with the purity of the dominant group. All of these hierarchies tend to be very concerned about purity of the dominant group. And so many American states defined Black as basically one drop of Black blood made a person Black. And that was a definition that the Nazis felt went too far for even them.
There are some examples in the book of your own personal experiences with this categorization and assumption from people, but I wonder what your emotional roller coaster must have been in the years it took to put this together. There's a sequence in the book where you run through all of these mass lynching events where the community comes out and celebrates as a human is tortured, and they would take pictures and trade them, and the post office had to ban it before people just put them in envelopes to share them. How did you emotionally and mentally make it through all this and maintain your sanity and your sense of hope, if you did?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I wouldn't have started the book if I didn't feel that there was a sense there was something good that could come out of it, something hopeful. I mean, I have to be optimistic in spite of some of the things that you learn along the way when you look back at the history. I have to say that this is very, very difficult to reckon with, absolutely. I found myself more than any other thing that I've written having to turn to music and other forms of ways to sort of bring tranquility and as I was being exposed to these things. I actually would do meditation. I listened to the music that was dealing, like sort of operating at the various megahertz to help you to remain calm. Wow. I ended up turning to the music, for example, of Philip Glass, whose music, his string quartet, in particular, number 5, I found to be propulsive, to like keep you going, but also meditative at the same time. So I just found myself having to turn to many different modes of remaining calm and steady throughout the process, more so than for most other things I've written.
And it also, it's a question that still sits in my mind as we sit through this pandemic, as it exposes the caste system, the inequalities in medical care, medical treatment, financial stability around the country. You know, I wonder how the country will do psychologically with, you know, they're expecting a mental health crisis because this type of trauma isn't singular, it's continued. What do you see as the, not just outcome of someone who would read the book and be struck by this realization, but what do you hope is the outcome of this moment as well?
Well, I'm hoping that first of all, with One for the Sons, when that book came out, people would say to me time and time again, no matter what their background was, they would say, I had no idea. I had no idea that this happened in our country. I had no idea that this would happen in the South. I had no idea this happened. For some people, they would say within the lifespan, their own lifespan, because a lot of these things are not ancient history. I mean, they're going back to the 1950s or 60s, and there are many people alive from that era. But you know, when the people would say they had no idea, it was an acknowledgement that somehow throughout all their education, they had not happened to have the chance to learn basic facts, basic history about our country. And not having an idea has consequences. It means that we don't really fully know how we got to where we are. I feel as if as Americans, we're almost like people who walked into a movie theater and we walked in the middle of the movie. And, you know, we see a car that's chasing a bus, and then there's a person running after the car, and we don't know who's doing what, why is this happening? And that's because we came in the middle of it, and it's hard to ever really catch up with what's going on. You can watch the end of the movie and still not really fully get everything until you go back and see it from the beginning. And so that's what history is, and that's what history does. And I think it's important for us to get on the same page about what's happened in our country. As you said, I went to other countries, spent a lot of time, tremendous amount of time actually, back and forth to Germany. And in the middle of Berlin, there's this massive monument to the people who perished in the Holocaust. It's necessary, it needs to be there. It's a magnificent witness to what happened. It takes up several football fields in the middle of a major world city. And what's interesting about it is that there's no signage. There's not a need for exhibitions that that detail the various things and the reasons why it's there, because people get educated as to why it's there. People know why it's there. They begin learning at a very young age, whatever's appropriate for their age level, to be able to learn what happened so that it will never happen again. And we're not on the same page in our country about basic facts about what's happened, basic understanding of the Civil War and Reconstruction and what happened after Reconstruction, how and why was Jim Crow instituted, what actually was Jim Crow. That's where people respond to the One for the Sons and say, I had no idea. We think about the water fountains and the restrooms, but it was so much more than that. It was an evolved, complex hierarchy of control over entire groups of people. A caste system. And so I am hoping that this will be a chance for people to really get to know our history, to know what's gone before us. You can't fix what you can't see. You can't diagnose what you have not named and do not understand. You can't heal from what you have not described. So I think that we need to know. I think partly we need to know. We don't know what's possible. What would it be like if people really truly knew the history? That's the basis for understanding, I think, and that's one of the things that this is asking people to do.
Well, in my view, better than anything else that's out there now, to explain our current moment, to explain our current divisions, and to explain our current inequalities. I mean, this book is just beautiful, but also terrifying because it's so real. In our last moment, I just want you to kind of give me your reaction to the announcement that Ava DuVernay will put everything she's got into a film adaptation of this. What can we expect? Do you get some input?
Well, obviously we can expect brilliance because she's brilliant. I'm overjoyed, obviously. It's so very, very new. It was just announced, just announced yesterday. So this is like just coming out into the world, and we're just at the very, very beginning stages of this. Really excited to see how, she converts this into her vision. And the book is still new. The book has only been out for 2 months. So I'm still recovering from processing what I've written. So all of this is very new, and the moment that it's entering the world is one that we could never have anticipated. It might take a long time on my books. Nothing is timed to anything. It just happens to be, this is the moment that it's coming out into the world, and this is the moment that she's going to be taking it up. So there's just a lot to be very excited about.
And can you just give us a hint into behind the scenes? Did she read it and reach out to you and say, I've got to make this? Did you hear from your people that her people were interested? How did it come to this?
It was kind of both. It was kind of both. I mean, the book hasn't been out that long, so
Right.
she must have read it very quickly, she dove into it very quickly, I should say. I know that she knows the book very, very well. She's really put her heart into it, and it just all came together. I mean, as you can see, the book has only been out for 2 months. This happened very quickly, very quickly.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to what will come of the movie version, but the book is incredible. It's insightful. It's so well researched, and as I keep saying, it's so well written. So appreciate you speaking with us today. Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Isabel Wilkerson. Her book is Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much.